Okay, welcome to the week 3 lecture. As we were talking about last week and during our discussion a bit this week, just looking at diversity in terms of numbers doesn't necessarily tell us the entire story. As we were looking at the Hollywood Diversity Report, a lot of you had questions about what kinds of roles are people playing? Maybe the numbers of women and people of color present on screen may seem like a good thing, but if they're being represented in stereotypical ways, maybe it's not. So we want to know a bit more about what kinds of roles are people playing, how are people being treated once they are in the room. So some of the risks that we have when there is just an increase of diversity, but not necessarily a lot of thought given to what kind of representation we're having, we get things like tokenism, which is basically, the official definition is a gesture which gives the appearance of fairness to minority groups and representation without any actual change in power. So we might have somebody kind of standing in to represent everyone of their identity, but they might not have a lot of power in the actual storytelling themselves. Tokenism is often rather symbolic rather than indicative of things actually changing and power actually shifting hands. You'll often hear things like the token black friend or the token gay character in a TV show. The other thing that just diversity without intention can lead to is a lot of stereotypes and caricature, some oversimplified representations of an entire identity group. And these have the danger of perpetuating attitudes which increase exclusion and discrimination. So we saw quite a bit of this in our disclosure documentary, where trans women were only being cast in roles as sex workers and not any other role. We saw this in the article looking at African American representation going all the way back to minstrelsy and its continued legacy today with the archetypes created there. We also heard a bit about different Native American stereotypes and Latinx stereotypes that are still being portrayed a lot in TV shows that don't give those characters fully complex and human representation. So what can we do about this? So along with diversity, we need a sense of inclusion. And what I'm talking about there is this kind of sense of welcoming and belonging within a diverse group. And an important thing about inclusion is members of the group have equitable opportunities to contribute in meaningful ways. Unlike tokenism, where they're just there, but don't necessarily have a whole lot of power, with a truly inclusive environment or inclusive mode of storytelling, those characters will have a way of meaningfully contributing to the story in their own right. So another important thing to think about is that word equitable. So I want to talk a little bit about equity versus equality. Equality is the idea that everyone has the same access or opportunities, whereas equity is everyone has fair access or opportunities which take their specific needs into account. As you see in the image on the left, we've got the 3 people watching baseball. We've got everybody has been given the same box to stand on so that they can watch the game. So the tall guy had already been able to watch the game on his own. The shorter girl is able to see over the fence now, but our kid in the wheelchair in the right isn't able to get up on the box. So even though he has the same thing given to him, he isn't able to use it in a way that's meaningful. Whereas we see in equity, Our shorter girl is given a second box so that she can stand and see the game a little bit better. And the kid in the wheelchair has a ramp so that he can wheel himself up to be able to watch the game. So usually when we're thinking about equity, it's not quite so obviously visible. So another example of how this might work specifically in the arts industry, specifically in TV and entertainment, is things like unpaid internships. Technically, we've got equality there. Everybody who applies has an equal chance of being offered the job. But that's not necessarily equity, because only people who have the financial means to be able to support themselves while working and not being paid, or can fall back on family to support them, are actually going to be able to take that job to gain that experience. Working class people, poorer people, which people of color tend to fall into that category because there's not quite as much generational wealth. People of color are less likely to be able to fall back on a wealthy family to support them while they go off to LA and learn the ins and outs of the movie industry. So our unpaid internships are perhaps equality and opportunity, but not necessarily equity. So when we're thinking about equity and creating inclusive, diverse environments and storytelling, we've also got to think about institutional oppression, which we touched a little bit on in week 1, and the idea of intersectionality, which is going to come up in the article that you're reading for this week. So institutional oppression is thinking kind of on a large scale about things like white supremacy, sexism, capitalism, heteronormativity, religious supremacy, ableism, things like that. So intersectionality is the idea that we have overlapping identities. The term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar, and she was specifically working in and around cases about employment discrimination towards specifically Black women. These companies were implementing policies that were offering equal opportunity to white women and to Black men. So they would say that we were serving both women and Black people, but we had Black women experiencing sexism and racism at the same time in employment. So Kimberly Crenshaw's theory was that since Black women are kind of sitting at the intersection of racism and sexism, they experience both at once and in a unique way from either Black men or white women. So this idea of intersectionality and intersecting oppressions has been adopted to talk a lot about a bunch of different identities as people experience oppression in different ways. So when we are thinking about intersectionality, we're referring to the system at large. The individual people might have something called a multiply marginalized identity. So people living in these intersections, in these overlapping places where they are experiencing multiple types of oppression at the same time, or multiple types of discrimination at the same time, which is going to look unique from people who might share part of their identity but not the entire thing. So we've got Black women, like Kimberly Crenshaw said, experiencing sexism and racism at the same time. We might have a Black trans woman is experiencing sexism at the same time as transphobia, at the same time as racism, and that's going to look different from what Black cisgender women experience. We might have a poor disabled person who is experiencing both classism and also ableism at the same time. So their experience is going to be influenced by both of those things at once and looking at how they overlap. If you look at the circles in the image on the right, each one has its own color, and in the spaces that it overlaps, it turns kind of a different color. So the experience itself looks a bit different than just adding racism plus sexism. It turns into kind of a unique experience of discrimination and oppression. Occasionally, this is talked about in a more positive light. You are experiencing the world through a lens of your own identity. So an experience specific to Black women and a perspective specific to Black women in that case. So another thing about this idea of inclusion is it can look different in different spaces. And at times it comes with a cost. So inclusion can at times look like assimilation, which demands that the quote unquote outsider group adopts the characteristics and expressions of the dominant cultural identity, usually at the cost of one's own identity. They learn to dress like, follow the same traditions as, in the same way as, use the same language and talk in the same manner as the dominant group in order to gain access to different spaces, in order to be included in those spaces. And assimilation becomes a condition of being included in those spaces. So assimilation values sameness. On the other hand, we've got this idea of integration, which basically is the idea that in an inclusive, diverse space, everyone can maintain all aspects of their own cultural identity and share them with the group rather than being forced to adopt different cultural kind of markers and practices. So in an integrated and inclusive environment, we've got a space that values the differences that people bring to the table. So finally, as we're looking to assess diversity and inclusion in the shows that we're watching, there are a few different kinds of questions that we might want to ask. Some of them that you all brought up when we were talking about the Hollywood Diversity Report. So some of the things might be, who is visible on screen and in what context? Are they having the power to tell their own story? Are they just in the background? Whose story do we get to hear? So do the people of color or POC, female, LGBTQ, disabled characters seem to have their own story, or does their presence only serve the protagonist's journey? Do POC, female, LGBTQ, disabled characters have an equitable share of the storytelling compared to their white, heterosexual, male, able-bodied counterparts? So again, we're coming back to that concept of equitable. Do they have their own power in the story? It's not a matter of just who is present, it is who has the power to shape the narrative